When you no longer chase what you've outgrown, it means your soul has finally stopped running in circles around the same lessons. There was a time when you mistook intensity for intimacy, when the chaos that drained you somehow felt like home. You confused familiarity with alignment, believing that what once comforted you must always belong to you. But healing reshapes your perception. It teaches you that not everything that once felt right is meant to stay, and not everything that leaves you is a loss. Growth begins the moment you recognize that what used to satisfy you no longer feeds your spirit, and you stop reaching back just because it's familiar. You begin to see the patterns you once called destiny. You start noticing how your mind tries to recreate the same emotional experiences with different faces. You realize that the need to chase was never about the person, the opportunity, or the outcome. It was about soothing the part of you that felt unworthy without validation. But now that part of you is quieter. You no longer chase closure from people who never offer clarity. You no longer pursue situations that make you question your value. You don't run after explanations for why something ended. You simply let it end, because you've learned that peace doesn't come from reopening what life has already closed. When you stop chasing what you've outgrown, you begin to respect the timing of your own transformation. You understand that sometimes evolution means walking away from what once made you feel alive. It's not about rejection, it's about resonance. You can love something deeply and still know it's not for you anymore. You can appreciate the memories, honor what it taught you, and still choose to move forward. There is a sacred strength in letting go without bitterness, in releasing without needing to be right, in trusting that your detachment is not coldness but wisdom. The old version of you would have chased. You would have begged for answers, for validation, for another chance to prove your worth. You would have tried to fix what was already falling apart. But now you understand that not everything broken is meant to be repaired. Sometimes the breaking is the blessing. Sometimes the collapse is the only way the soul can rebuild on truth instead of illusion. When you stop chasing what's behind you, you give the universe permission to show you what's ahead. You create space for what matches your current vibration, not your old wounds. The shift happens quietly. You wake up one day and realize you no longer feel the pull. The messages you once waited for no longer matter. The attention you used to crave now feels heavy. You stop replaying old conversations in your mind because you no longer seek to rewrite them. You stop romanticizing the past because you finally see it without the lens of longing. You understand that what you were chasing was never truly yours. It was the idea of who you thought you needed to be in order to deserve it. Healing teaches you that you never had to chase what was meant for you. It teaches you that true alignment flows naturally, without force, without confusion, without the exhaustion of trying to earn peace. When you no longer chase what you've outgrown, you begin to trust the rhythm of endings. You stop clinging to what's familiar just because you fear the unknown. You realize that letting go is not losing control, it's surrendering to clarity. The people and environments that no longer fit start to fade, and instead of resisting, you allow it. You understand that their exit is not punishment, it's preparation. The emptiness left behind is not a void to be filled, but a sacred space for new energy to enter. You stop asking why it ended and start asking what it revealed. You stop mourning the loss of comfort and start celebrating the arrival of truth. You find power in stillness. You no longer chase validation because you've begun validating yourself. You no longer run after attending on because you found contentment in your own presence. The energy you used to spend trying to hold on to things now returns to you. You use it to create, to grow, to build a life that reflects your healed identity. You no longer look backward for meaning. You become the meaning. You start seeing life as a series of seasons, each one necessary, each one purposeful. You no longer resent the winter because you understand it prepares the soil for spring. The transformation is subtle but irreversible. You speak differently. You respond instead of react. You make decisions from wisdom rather than fear. You begin to live in alignment with your truth instead of trying to prove it. The chase once gave you adrenaline, but now peace gives you power. The thrill of the old cycles no longer excites you because you've tasted something more profound. Stability, self-respect, emotional maturity. You no longer confuse love with attachment, presence with possession, or connection with dependence. You understand that what belongs to you will never require you to shrink to keep it. And so you stand in the stillness of your own evolution. You no longer reach for what you've outgrown because your spirit recognizes when something has served its purpose. You can bless what once broke you, thank what once drained you, and walk away without resentment. You understand that detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means you've learned to love without losing yourself. The person you used to be would have chased, begged, clung, and pleaded. The person you are now knows that what's meant for you will meet you when you stand still, whole and ready. There was a time when silence felt unbearable. The absence of noise, of validation, of constant motion made you restless. You mistook quiet for loneliness, stillness for emptiness, and peace for stagnation. Your mind was addicted to movement because the noise kept you distracted from the ache you didn't want to feel. You filled every moment with conversation, screens, music, plans, anything to avoid being alone with your own thoughts. But silence has a strange way of calling you back to yourself. When you can finally sit with the silence without needing to fill it, you've crossed into a deeper layer of healing that cannot be measured by words or applause. The silence used to echo with your insecurities. It used to replay the things you wished you could forget, the mistakes, the losses, the unmet expectations. Every pause felt like an invitation for your inner critic to speak louder. But over time, something changed. You began to realize that the silence was not your enemy, it was your mirror. It reflected everything you had been avoiding, but it also revealed everything you were becoming. The discomfort you once felt in stillness was not punishment. It was purification. It was your soul asking to be heard above the noise. When you can sit with silence, it means you've stopped running from yourself. You no longer seek distractions to drown out your emotions. You no longer need the chaos of others to feel alive. You've learned to listen to the rhythm of your breath, to the subtleties of your intuition, to the truth that speaks quietly beneath your thoughts. You've discovered that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of awareness. It's the sacred space where healing happens, where understanding deepens, where the soul finally exhales. You start to notice how silence exposes the truth of your relationships. You realize how many connections were built on the need to escape yourselves, rather than truly see each other. You see how often conversations were used to fill the emptiness rather than share authenticity. Now, when you sit with someone in silence and still feel understood, you recognize that as rare, sacred alignment. You no longer fear quiet moments with others, because you no longer fear quiet moments with yourself. You've made peace with your own company, and that peace has become your foundation. In silence, your thoughts begin to soften. The constant stream of what-ifs, should-haves, and could-bests loses its grip. You begin to separate your true voice from the noise of your conditioning. You realize that not every thought deserves attention, not every feeling demands reaction. You start witnessing your emotions instead of becoming them. The stillness teaches you that the storm inside you doesn't need to be fought, it needs to be observed. The act of sitting quietly becomes an act of deep strength because it requires you to trust that nothingness can still hold meaning. When you can sit with the silence without needing to fill it, you begin to access a kind of inner wisdom that noise always drowned out. You find clarity not through thinking harder, but through listening deeper. You start to recognize the difference between urgency and intuition. Urgency yells, intuition whispers. It's only in the quiet that you can tell which is speaking. You begin to make decisions that feel aligned rather than forced, patient rather than impulsive. The stillness becomes your guide, the compass that points you back toward your truth every time the world pulls you away. You notice the world differently when you stop fearing silence. You start hearing things you used to miss. The hum of the earth, the pattern of your own heartbeat, the sincerity hidden between words. You realize how much of life is spoken in the spaces between sounds. You start valuing pauses more than noise. You no longer rush to fill the gaps in conversation or force meaning into moments that are meant to breathe. You discover that silence has its own language, one that speaks in presence, awareness, and peace. Healing through silence teaches you patience. You stop demanding immediate answers. You learn to sit with uncertainty without collapsing under it. The world still moves fast, but you no longer let it rush your soul. You begin to understand that not every problem needs fixing. Not every wound needs explanation. Some things just need space, unrushed, unforced, unfilled. You allow life to unfold rather than trying to control every outcome. The need to fill the silence was always about control, about avoiding the unknown. Now you find freedom in not knowing. The quiet becomes your teacher. It reveals what's real and what's illusion. It strips away the layers of performance, the personas you wore to survive. It shows you who you are when there's nothing left to prove. In the silence you meet the unedited version of yourself, the one that doesn't perform for love, that doesn't chase validation, that doesn't shrink for approval. You begin to understand that the version of you who can sit peacefully alone has finally found belonging within. You stop needing to explain your calm to people who are still addicted to noise. You stop apologizing for choosing solitude over chaos. You no longer equate stillness with weakness because you felt the power that silence carries. It has taught you to observe rather than react, to pause rather than defend, to breathe rather than break. The silence has become your sanctuary, not because the world outside has changed, but because your relationship with yourself has. In this space of quiet, you realize that peace is not something you find, it's something you allow. You allow life to slow down. You allow thoughts to settle like dust. You allow emotions to pass without labeling them. You allow yourself to be here, fully, without needing to escape. You've learned to honor the moment for what it is instead of what it should be. The silence no longer feels empty because you filled it with awareness, with presence, with acceptance of what is. And so, when you can sit with the silence without needing to fill it, you've reached a level of wholeness that cannot be taught by words or measured by the world's definitions of success. You've become the calm you used to search for in others. You've learned that true strength is not in how loudly you speak, but in how deeply you listen. You no longer run from yourself. You return to yourself again and again in the quiet where everything finally makes sense without needing to be explained. There comes a point in your growth where you stop trying to make others see you clearly. You stop bending your truth into shapes that fit their comfort. You stop editing your emotions to appear easier to love. You realize that explaining yourself over and over to people committed to misunderstanding you only drains your spirit. When you stop explaining yourself to be understood, it's not arrogance, it's alignment. It's the quiet recognition that your worth was never meant to be negotiated through someone else's perception. You used to think that if you could just find the right words, people would finally get you. You replayed conversations in your mind, rewriting them, trying to sound softer, calmer, more reasonable. You believed understanding was the bridge to acceptance. And so you kept trying to build it even when the other person refused to meet you halfway. But healing teaches you something sacred. Not everyone has the capacity to hear your truth, because not everyone is meant to walk beside it. You begin to see that some people listen not to understand, but to reply, to defend, to reaffirm their own narrative. You realize that no amount of clarity will change a mind that doesn't want to see you as you are. When you stop explaining yourself to be understood, you start conserving energy that used to be spent on convincing. You no longer chase validation through explanation. You no longer rehearse emotional speeches in your head just to justify how you feel. You stop proving your goodness, your effort, your love. You stop shrinking your truth to fit the comfort zones of others who only loved you when you were convenient. The silence that follows may feel heavy at first, but it's sacred. It's the silence of self-respect, reclaiming its space. You begin to understand that explanation is often a form of control. When you try to make someone understand you, what you're really trying to do is control their perception of you. But perception is not your responsibility, it's theirs. You cannot manage how others choose to interpret your energy, your boundaries, or your intentions. You can only live in integrity with yourself. You can only speak truth once and allow silence to do what words cannot. The healed version of you trusts that whoever is meant to understand will do so naturally, without persuasion. You remember the times you spoke your truth gently, honestly, vulnerably, and still were dismissed. You remember the conversations where your pain was minimized, where your feelings were twisted into accusations. You remember the exhaustion of trying to explain that your boundaries were not rejection, that your distance was not hatred, that your voice was not defiance. And in remembering, you realize how much energy you lost trying to be understood in spaces that were never built for truth. The freedom begins the moment you stop seeking understanding from those who cannot meet you at the level of consciousness you now inhabit. When you stop explaining yourself, you start trusting yourself. You no longer second guess your intuition just because someone questions it. You no longer doubt your decisions just because others don't agree. You stop needing external confirmation to validate internal knowing. The opinions of others no longer carry the same weight because you learn to listen to the quiet authority of your own spirit. You no longer chase peace through permission. You no longer beg to be seen because you see yourself. There is a calm that settles over you when you finally release the need to be understood. You begin to realize that true understanding cannot be forced. It can only be offered. You start valuing connection built on resonance rather than explanation. You notice the people who just get it without needing 1,000 words. You start gravitating toward those who listen not to respond, but to feel. These are the souls who mirror your growth, who meet your silence with peace instead of confusion. You stop chasing comprehension from those who never care to comprehend, and in doing so, you create room for those who naturally align with your truth. You learn that the need to explain is born from the wounds of rejection. You once believed that if people understood your heart, they wouldn't leave. So you overshared, over-defended, over-explained. You tried to turn yourself into a story everyone could read easily. But healing has taught you that your depth isn't meant for mass consumption. You no longer translate your soul into a language that dilutes its meaning. You've learned to be at peace with being misunderstood because you no longer equate misunderstanding with being unworthy. You can hold your truth quietly, knowing that those meant to understand will do so in time or not at all. And either way, you will still be whole. When you stop explaining yourself, conversations change. You begin to speak with more presence and less pressure. You listen without needing to defend. You choose peace over persuasion. The urge to justify fades, replaced by an inner assurance that doesn't depend on agreement. You find beauty in the pauses, in the moments where words are no longer needed to prove anything. You no longer feel compelled to correct every misconception or fix every false impression. You understand that your energy speaks louder than explanations ever could. This freedom doesn't make you detached, it makes you authentic. You stop being the version of yourself that needed everyone's approval to feel secure. You stop performing your emotions for validation. You live from a place of quiet confidence, knowing that truth doesn't require defense. It simply exists. You no longer need to convince the world of your intentions because you have learned that those operating at your frequency already feel them. You stop explaining, not out of pride, but because peace has become more valuable than being right. And in that peace, you finally see how much time you've reclaimed. Time once spent arguing, clarifying, proving, and apologizing now belongs to your growth. You redirect that energy toward creation, purpose, and stillness. You no longer measure connection by how much someone understands you, but by how safe you feel being yourself in their presence. You no longer explain your boundaries, they are self-evident. You no longer justify your healing, it simply unfolds. The more you honor your truth in silence, the more you realize that understanding was never the goal. Alignment was. Healing changes the way you see pain. The moments that once shattered you begin to reveal themselves as sacred messengers. You stop seeing every emotional reaction as a sign of weakness or failure, and you start recognizing it as communication from within. When you reach the stage where you can recognize your triggers as teachers, not threats, it means your consciousness has expanded beyond reaction into reflection. You no longer run from discomfort because you've learned that what hurts is often what's trying to heal you. A trigger is not the enemy, it is an echo. It's the past calling out for attention, reminding you of something unresolved, something that still holds emotional weight. Before, when you were unhealed, every trigger felt like an attack. You took every word personally, every criticism as rejection, every silence as abandonment. You lived on edge, ready to defend, ready to explain, ready to protect the wounded parts of you from being exposed. But now something in you has shifted. You've begun to understand that when something triggers you, it's not trying to destroy you, it's trying to reveal where you're still carrying pain that wants to be seen, acknowledged, and released. When you start viewing your triggers as teachers, you move from blame to awareness. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? You ask, what is this showing me? That small change transforms everything. The situation no longer has power over you because you've taken ownership of your inner world. You no longer point fingers at others for making you feel a certain way. You understand that they only touched what was already tender. They may have pressed the wound, but they didn't create it. That realization turns reaction into revelation. The moment you stop running from your triggers, they stop chasing you. Every emotional reaction becomes an invitation to look deeper. Anger teaches you where your boundaries were crossed. Sadness shows you what needs to be let go. Jealousy reveals where you're still doubting your worth. Resentment uncovers where you've given more than you received. Anxiety points to where you don't yet trust the process of life. These emotions, though uncomfortable, are your most honest teachers. They guide you back to the parts of yourself that you abandoned when you were just trying to survive. You begin to see that healing isn't about avoiding pain. It's about learning to interpret it. There's a strength that comes from staying present in your triggers instead of reacting to them. You begin to breathe through the discomfort rather than letting it control you. You start noticing patterns in your reactions, the same feelings that rise when certain words are said, the same tension that appears in specific situations. You become curious instead of defensive. You ask, what is this trying to teach me about myself? And slowly, you start uncovering the deeper truth that your emotional pain was never your enemy. It was your compass pointing toward what still needed love. When you can hold space for your triggers without shame, you begin to access emotional maturity. You stop seeing yourself as broken for feeling deeply. You stop seeing emotional reactions as regression. Instead, you honor them as signs of awareness. You know you're healing when you can be triggered and still choose not to project your pain onto others. You can sit with the discomfort, observe it, and respond with compassion instead of chaos. You learn to self-soothe, to regulate, to remind yourself that you are safe even when the past whispers that you're not. The people who trigger you the most often mirror the parts of yourself you haven't yet accepted. The friend who always competes with you reflects your own fear of not being enough. The partner who withdraws emotionally awakens your old wounds of neglect. The colleague who undermines you shows you where you still seek validation. Life keeps repeating these mirrors until you recognize the reflection not as punishment, but as guidance. The universe doesn't send triggers to hurt you. It sends them to help you awaken. Each one carries information about where you are still unconsciously giving your power away. Over time, you stop labeling people as villains simply because they activate something painful in you. You begin to thank them silently for the clarity they bring. They expose your hidden insecurities, not to shame you, but to help you integrate them. You realize that the trigger isn't the problem. It's the unresolved emotion beneath it. And when you address that emotion with honesty instead of avoidance, the trigger loses its power. The same situations that once left you spiraling now leave you thoughtful. The same words that once pierced your heart now land softly, unable to wound what you've already healed. When you recognize triggers as teachers, you also develop compassion for others. You start to see that everyone is reacting from their own unhealed places. You no longer take things as personally as before because you understand that everyone is projecting what they haven't yet processed. You stop matching their pain with more pain. You stop engaging in cycles of defensiveness and instead choose understanding. You see how your own healing ripples outward, softening not only your life, but the lives you touch. You begin to trust discomfort as a form of divine communication. Every emotional wave becomes an opportunity to grow. You don't suppress it or run from it. You allow it to move through you, knowing it carries wisdom. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten, and triggers are its way of saying, pay attention here. You start treating those moments as sacred rather than shameful. You breathe, you listen, you release. You start to realize that healing isn't about never being triggered again. It's about responding differently when you are. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It takes patience, awareness, and deep honesty. But the more you practice it, the lighter you become. You stop fearing emotional discomfort because you understand its purpose. You stop avoiding conversations that bring up your insecurities because you're no longer trying to protect an old identity. You let yourself feel everything because you finally trust yourself to handle it. You no longer collapse under the weight of emotional turbulence. You rise through it with wisdom. To recognize triggers as teachers is to reclaim your power. It's to understand that nothing outside of you truly has control unless you hand it over. It's to stand in the middle of chaos and say, I can learn from this. You no longer resist the lessons disguised as pain. You no longer fight the mirrors that life places before you. You meet them with awareness, gratitude, and strength. And in that awareness, you transform every wound into wisdom, every reaction into revelation, every discomfort into a doorway back to yourself. Loving without abandoning yourself is one of the most profound signs of inner healing. It's a turning point that comes after you've spent years giving too much, losing yourself in others, mistaking sacrifice for love. For a long time, you were taught that love meant choosing someone else even when it hurt you, that it meant understanding everyone while no one tried to understand you. You called it devotion, but it was often self-erasure. When you begin to love in a way that doesn't abandon yourself, you start to rewrite every old definition of love that came from pain instead of peace. There was a time when you confused attachment with connection. You thought that closeness meant merging entirely with another person, feeling their emotions as your own, fixing their wounds at the expense of your own stability. You mistook chaos for passion because peace felt unfamiliar. You stayed where you were shrinking because you believed love required endurance, not boundaries. You silenced your truth to keep the peace, thinking that love could only survive if you didn't take up too much space. But that kind of love isn't love. It's fear disguised as loyalty. And healing begins the moment you realize you can care deeply for others without abandoning yourself in the process. When you love in a way that doesn't abandon yourself, you stop chasing validation through self-sacrifice. You stop believing that being chosen means being worthy. You start recognizing that you are already whole before anyone enters your life. You understand that love is not supposed to complete you. It's supposed to complement your wholeness. You stop pouring from an empty cup because you've learned that depletion is not devotion. You no longer give to be seen. You give because it flows naturally, not compulsively. You start creating relationships that are built on mutual nourishment rather than silent resentment. You begin to notice the ways you used to disappear in relationships. The times you said yes when your spirit screamed no. The moments you tolerated disrespect because you didn't want to lose someone's affection. The way you ignored your intuition just to maintain the illusion of harmony. But now, something in you refuses to disappear again. You've learned that your needs are not burdens, your emotions are not too macho. Our truth is not something to apologize for. You understand that self-respect is the foundation of real love. Without it, connection becomes survival instead of sanctuary. Loving without abandoning yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care with boundaries. It means you love with awareness. You can hold space for someone's pain without taking responsibility for it. You can listen deeply without losing your voice. You can give compassion without letting it turn into self-neglect. You know when to stay and when to walk away, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. You no longer equate leaving with failure. You recognize that protecting your peace is an act of love, not selfishness. You know that love cannot flourish where you constantly betray your own soul. You start realizing that love is not meant to drain, it's meant to expand. The relationships you attract now feel different. They don't demand that you shrink or pretend. They feel calm, balanced, and honest. You stop mistaking intensity for depth and chaos for chemistry. You crave peace more than drama, understanding more than attention, connection more than control. You find beauty in emotional stability because it allows you to breathe freely. You realize that love rooted in safety, respect, and reciprocity feels like home, not a battlefield you're always trying to survive. When you love in a way that doesn't abandon yourself, communication changes. You speak your truth without fear of being misunderstood. You don't beg to be heard, you express to be known. You stop walking on eggshells because you no longer prioritize comfort over honesty. You can say no without guilt, and you can say yes without resentment. You understand that real love can hold boundaries without breaking. You no longer feel the need to explain your worth. Your energy speaks it for you. There's a deeper kind of intimacy that comes with this evolution. You begin to love from overflow rather than emptiness. You can hold someone close without losing your sense of individuality. You can be vulnerable without being consumed. You love with open hands instead of gripping tightly out of fear. You give because you want to, not because you're afraid of being abandoned. You understand that love is not control, it's freedom. It's the ability to choose each other again and again without losing yourselves in the choosing. This kind of love is rooted in self-awareness. You know your triggers, your patterns, your limits. You recognize when your old wounds start to surface, and instead of projecting them onto others, you hold yourself through them. You no longer expect someone else to heal what you've already started mending. You take responsibility for your emotions while also expecting emotional accountability from those around you. You no longer carry relationships on your back alone. You walk beside those who meet you in equal effort and energy. Loving without abandoning yourself also means you've made peace with solitude. You don't need a relationship to feel complete because you've already built a home within yourself. You enjoy companionship, but you don't depend on it for identity. You no longer confuse loneliness with emptiness. You know that being alone is not a punishment. It's a sacred pause where you recalibrate your energy, reconnect with your essence, and realign with your truth. Because of this, you choose love consciously, not fearfully. You no longer settle just to avoid silence. You wait for connection that feels like clarity, not confusion. You become more selective, not out of ego, but out of wisdom. You stop accepting half presence, half effort, half truths. You stop romanticizing potential and start honoring reality. You no longer chase love that costs you peace. You stop seeking healing in others because you've already learned to find it within. You understand that the right love will never require you to abandon the person you fought so hard to become. It will not dim your light. It will respect it, protect it, and grow beside it. When you love in a way that doesn't abandon yourself, you stop betraying your intuition to keep relationships alive. You trust that if something requires you to lose yourself, it's not love, it's attachment. You understand that boundaries are bridges, not walls. They allow connection to flow freely, grounded in respect. You learn that love and self-preservation can coexist, that you can be soft without being submissive, that you can care deeply without losing your center. You love from truth, not fear, from abundance, not scarcity, from strength, not survival. You become the embodiment of the love you once begged others to give you, and in that embodiment, you find peace.